In this next section, we're going to try and understand the definition and some of the core components of what we mean by transdisciplinary practice. It's a very confusing word. It's a word that's similar to many other words, and it has many different definitions, and people have used it in many different ways. But we think it's important that there's at least some sort of common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about transdisciplinary practice in our courses. So there are many different terms for different ways of moving away from traditional scientific and practical disciplines. And some of these terms include transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, intradisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, pluridisciplinary, supradisciplinary, and none of these terms really have completely agreed definitions. Transdisciplinary or transdisciplinarity also has many definitions, but it has some common principles and approaches. And probably the strongest agreement about transdisciplinary practice is that it's about working together to solve complex problems. I think that there's one definition that I've found quite useful, that it covers most of the important ideas about transdisciplinary practice, which appears on the screen. I'm not going to read it out to you at the moment because we're going to take each section of the definition and talk about what it actually means and its importance in the next few slides. So to start off with, this definition talks about transdisciplinary practice as society-oriented research. This emphasises that the approach is driven by the need to recognise and address important problems in society at all levels, local, national and global levels. And that traditional scientific approaches have not been particularly successful at doing this. In this section it talks about research, but when we talk about transdisciplinary practice, we're not only talking about research, we're also including approaches to education, policy, intervention, and entrepreneurship that are oriented towards addressing complex social problems. The next section talks about the idea that transdisciplinary practice complements the spectrum of research forms. An important word here is the word complements. This indicates that a transdisciplinary approach does not replace your specific disciplinary knowledge and expertise and the approaches that you're used to using, but complements them by allowing different disciplines to draw their expertise together. In particular, it adds to the value of individual disciplines by recognising the value of a wide range of approaches to research and to societal problem solving. The next component of the definition talks about cooperation between scientists and practitioners, and perhaps this is even the most important part of the definition of transdisciplinary practice. So one of the common themes that you find in discussions about transdisciplinary practice is that there is a need to break down barriers between people with an academic orientation, which is sometimes called Mode 1 knowledge, and those with a practical or life world experience orientation, sometimes called Mode 2 knowledge. Many people consider this even more important than addressing the barriers between academic disciplines. The next component of the definition talks about bridging the growing gap between science and the public. One of the important issues driving attempts to develop transdisciplinary practice is the recognition that science often seems impossible to understand to ordinary people, and it seems irrelevant and self-serving to many people in the general public, and even to people with leadership roles in policy, government, business, and civil society. So we need to find ways to bridge the gap with these other sectors of society and to talk the language and to address the priorities that are important to them and not just the interests and priorities that are important to us as academics. The next component of the definition talks about promoting social learning and negotiation processes. So there are a range of attitudes and social skills that are critical to successful transdisciplinary practice. And these include respect and valuing of different types of knowledge and expertise. For example, academic knowledge, policy knowledge, management and implementation knowledge, local knowledge of communities' environments, and many other types of knowledge. There's a need to find common language and terminology to discuss with people, and we need a willingness to let go of the jargon and the terminology of our particular disciplines. And there's a need for familiarity and expertise in processes for co-creation of planning and co-creation with different academic disciplines and with, in particular, the people who are affected most by the social problems that we're trying to address. The next component of the definition talks about that we need to consider scientific and life world problems as well as abstract and case-specific knowledge. Scientific and academic traditions often value abstract, theoretical and general knowledge above case-specific and local knowledge. And often we seek to develop solutions that are generally applicable to everyone without recognising some of the differences between specific situations. And we can have a tendency to impose our solutions in a top-down way. In a life world approach, people in specific places and times seek to solve the problems of their situation, their circumstances, their environment, and they often create good ideas that are suitable for their environment and which could be shared more broadly for people in other settings. So we need the ability to think both generally and locally, and to think both abstractly and in relation to actual real-world cases and situations. We need the ability to think in both a top-down and bottom-up directions. And we need the ability to allow transdisciplinary teams to draw on the strengths of all of these different perspectives. We also need skills and abilities in relation to participatory processes. So while transdisciplinarity is often compared with other ways of relating to different disciplines, it's also often compared to different types of collaborative problem solving that we're very familiar with, such as participatory action research, agricultural extension, collaborative design, co-creation. And whatever discipline you come from, it's very likely that there are ideas that are very similar to transdisciplinary practice that you're already familiar with, particularly when you talk about joint problem solving and working together to develop solutions to problems with business, government, community, and so on. To be skilled in transdisciplinary practice and to have a transdisciplinary team, it will usually be necessary to have someone who is engaged in or leads these teams to have knowledge and skills in different participatory development approaches. And you can bring those skills that you are familiar with already from your discipline to apply with them within transdisciplinary teams. We need to, learning about these different approaches and starting to apply particular approaches may be a practical way and a way that's familiar to you for starting to work in transdisciplinary ways. So you could, if you work in agriculture, maybe you can look at the principles of agricultural extension and how that involves academic, academia and industry and farmers working together to develop solutions to problems. Finally, transdisciplinary practice seeks to make knowledge available efficiently and accessible for decision making and for all people, not just policymakers decision making, but for people at every level. And in particular, this is saying that we're working to develop knowledge that is applied to practical problems of decision making and not just for academic publication. So while policymakers are sometimes called decision makers, the reality is that addressing complex problems requires many people at all levels of society to make good decisions. These include policy decisions, business decisions, and the decisions of daily life of individuals and families and communities. A transdisciplinary approach seeks to meet the information needs of all of these people. So we're seeking to develop and communicate information that we know answers the questions of these different people, and that's not just oriented towards academic debate and academic information sharing. A focus on decision making also means that the knowledge that is produced can be tested quickly, because you can apply it and see if the solutions that you're developing work or if they need to be improved. They can also be tested repeatedly by assessing how usable the ideas and decisions we make are for practical action. This means that we can then identify where we need to develop additional knowledge or have more debate or develop additional solutions.